The house smelled like vanilla and rose water. I'd spent hours perfecting the frosting. Each delicate swirl on the anniversary cake piped with the same care I used to give my wedding clients back when Wild Grace Blooms was still mine. The cake sat proudly on the dessert table, a soft pink centerpiece beneath a glittering 40 years topper. The dining room buzzed with warmth neighbors, old friends, relatives I hadn't seen since high school. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loud. My mother's prized china, pulled from the cabinet once a decade, gleamed under the chandelier. I took my seat, still brushing powdered sugar from my hands. Mom sat across from me in her silk blouse, hair curled just right. She lifted her wine glass and tapped it with a spoon. The room fell quiet. "To 40 years of love," she said, "and the grace to know when to let things go." At first, I thought it was poetic, until she turned to me. "You're a burden, Calandra," she said. "We want to live without you." My breath caught. I thought I'd misheard her, but the words were still echoing, hanging in the air like smoke. I turned to Dad. He didn't flinch, just took another sip of wine. Chairs creaked, forks paused midair. Diane from next door lowered her gaze. No one spoke, not even my sister. I smiled. I don't know why. Reflex. Maybe. I lifted my glass, sipped, and let the burn settle behind my ribs. Then I stood, smoothing the napkin across my lap, and walked away. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. Upstairs, I pulled my suitcase from the closet, packed slowly, essentials only, some clothes, my laptop, 3 framed photos from my nightstand. The house was hushed as I slipped out the side door and into the night. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was done pretending I was wanted. By morning, I was 10 miles away in a motel room with a flickering hallway light and a stiff pillow that smelled like bleach. I lay on top of the covers, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling, and let myself feel everything I hadn't let show at the table. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. Tomorrow, I'd begin to understand just how much they depended on the person they had so easily cast aside. I woke before the sun, stiff from the motel mattress and still dressed in the same blouse from dinner. The silence in the room wasn't peaceful, it was hollow, a kind of quiet that made you aware of your own breathing. I sat up slowly, legs dangling over the edge of the bed, and stared at the carpet. I'd known this day was coming. I just hadn't expected it to arrive so loudly, in front of a room full of people. 5 years ago, I'd walked away from something I loved. Wild Grace Blooms was never a booming business, but it was mine. Every petal, every invoice, every late-night wedding arrangement. My hands built it. When the call came, Mom's voice had trembled medical bills, repairs, late mortgage notices piling up. She said they were drowning. I didn't hesitate. I sold the shop for $132,000. I didn't even try to negotiate. Just handed the keys to a young couple who wanted to add a modern twist to my rustic displays. Then I moved back into my childhood bedroom, promising myself it was temporary. But temporary stretched into years. I got a job at a nursery, half the pay, none of the pride, but it kept the money flowing, and the money never stopped flowing. Every month, and not once. Not once did they sit me down and say, "We see what you're doing. Thank you." Instead, they told me I was a burden, back at the motel. I opened my laptop. I needed to see the numbers, needed to feel them stacked in rows and columns. Unarguable. I scrolled through the auto payments. My account had been their lifeline, and I hadn't even realized how deeply. My fingers hovered over the cancellation tabs. Not yet, but soon. I closed the screen, leaned back in the creaking motel chair, and stared at the ceiling. They said they wanted to live without me. Maybe it was time to show them what that actually looked like. I opened the spreadsheet I'd started keeping 2 years ago, not out of bitterness, but to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. Utilities consistent. $300 a month, give or take. Water usually $120. The internet and streaming bundles $83. The mortgage, $1,000 even. Property taxes every quarter. Insurance twice a year. Groceries were harder to track. I'd swipe my card whenever the fridge looked empty or when Mom added things to the list and left it on the counter like an expectation. Repairs came in waves, plumbing leaks, an aging HVAC replacing the back steps. I tallied up the last 12 months alone over $22,000. Quietly, automatically withdrawn from the life I had put on pause. I used to think it was love, or maybe obligation. But sitting in this cheap motel chair with my laptop humming and my back aching, it looked like something else. I remembered the way Mom would introduce me at church. This is Calandra, our oldest. She's staying with us for a bit while she figures things out. I remembered the way Dad never asked about work, how he'd glance up from his lawnmower repairs in the garage when I came home, but never said much beyond. Dinners on the stove. And Mara, my sister, once said during breakfast, "It's not like you have a real job anyway." I had laughed it off, but I didn't forget. It hadn't started this way. The first few months back in that house. There were signs of appreciation. Mom made me tea some nights. Dad fixed my old car. But eventually, they stopped noticing what I gave and only saw me as someone who stayed. And I stayed. Longer than I should have. I kept telling myself I was preserving something. The house. Their dignity. Our family. But all I'd really done was exchange my independence for their comfort. I closed the spreadsheet, then reopened it. My cursor hovered over the autopay settings tab again. Maybe the only way to reclaim my future was to stop financing theirs. Hadley opened the door before I even knocked. Her face was soft with concern. Her voice low when she said, "Come in." Honey, as if any louder might make me break. Their living room hadn't changed since the last time I was here. Warm wood floors, mismatched throw pillows, a crooked painting from a craft fair that Hadley swore was charm. Not a flaw. It felt lived in. Real. The kind of space where you didn't have to be anyone but tired and honest. Marcus appeared from the kitchen with a mug of tea already in hand. The way people do when they know you well enough not to ask first. I sank into the couch and didn't speak for a long time. When I finally did, I told them everything. Not just the dinner, though I did tell them that. Every word but the years leading up to it. The shop I gave up. The payments I made. The slow disappearance of gratitude. The weight of always being needed. Never wanted. Hadley didn't interrupt. She just placed a hand on my arm and squeezed. Marcus sat across from me, legs crossed, brow furrowed, silent until I finished. Then he said, "You ever hear about what happened with Ezra?" Vance Ezra had been an acquaintance from our early business days, owned a lawn care company and took care of his family for nearly a decade, paid for everything. Then, one day, his daughter told him he was controlling, said he was in the way. So he walked, turned off every financial tap. Within 2 months, the house was repossessed, the car gone, the daughter living in a one-bedroom across town. He didn't do it to punish her. Marcus said he just stopped letting her write checks with someone else's account. I stared into my tea, the steam fading. That night, alone in their guest room, I opened my laptop again. My fingers didn't tremble this time. Electricity cancel, water cancel, internet cancel, streaming, insurance, online grocery account. The digital umbilical cord severed, thread by thread. Each click was a quiet goodbye, a sentence they never let me say aloud. I didn't feel angry, just clear. They said they wanted to live without me. Now they could. I closed the lid, exhaled slowly, and finally lay back in a bed that wasn't mine, but for the first time in years, didn't feel like it cost me everything to stay in. I woke to sunlight slanting through the guest room blinds and the faint clink of dishes in the kitchen. For a moment, I let myself pretend it was a regular morning, one where I hadn't been called a burden, hadn't walked out, hadn't spent the night untangling years of obligation with a few careful keystrokes. Then I reached for my phone. 17 missed calls, all from Mom. 2 voicemails. 1 text. Call me now. I stared at the screen without opening a single one. 10 minutes later. It rang again. I didn't recognize the number, but I didn't need to. I answered without speaking. "What the hell did you do?" Mara's voice was sharp. Frantic. "The internet's down. I have client submissions due today. The power's flickering. Mom's freaking out." I kept my voice calm. I stopped paying. There was a pause. Then she scoffed. "What is wrong with you? You can't just pull the plug on everything without warning." "I wasn't warned when I was called a burden," I said. "That was," she faltered. "That was just Mom. She was emotional. You know how she gets." "And, Dad," silence. I waited. "You're being dramatic," she said finally. "Look, just flip everything back on." "Okay, we'll talk later." "No." Another pause. "This one colder." Mara snapped. "This is exactly why no one wants to deal with you. You always make everything about yourself." I didn't answer. I just ended the call. Hadley walked in a few minutes later, holding a plate of toast and a soft look I didn't deserve but appreciated anyway. I didn't tell her what Mara said. I didn't need to. The phone was still buzzing on the nightstand, a steady reminder of the chaos I'd left behind. By noon, the calls had slowed, but the silence felt heavier. No apology came, not from Mom, not from Dad, just panic and blame, like I'd stolen something instead of simply stepping away. The weight in my chest wasn't anger, it was recognition. That may be all this time. I hadn't been loved for who I was, but for what I provided. Later that afternoon, the messages changed tone. One from Mom read the water's off. "I don't know what's happening. Please call me." Still no mention of what was said at dinner. No acknowledgement. Just logistics. Crisis. Expectation. I powered the phone off. That evening, Marcus grilled vegetables in the backyard while Hadley poured us glasses of sweet tea. The air was still warm, the light just starting to shift. I sat between them, quiet. My hands wrapped around the glass, watching the smoke rise from the grill. They didn't ask me for anything. They didn't pretend to understand everything. They just let me exist. It was the first time in years I felt like I could. And tomorrow, I knew the unraveling would begin. It didn't take long for word to spread. Birmingham was big enough to disappear in. But the neighborhood wasn't. Hadley heard from a co-worker who'd heard from her cousin that the Wynn family was behind on their mortgage. Diane from 2 doors down had apparently stopped by with store-bought muffins and left with a tight-lipped story about the utilities being out for 3 days straight. And Mara, my sister, who once posted about freedom in freelancing, was now working night shifts at a 24-hour supermarket off Lakeshore. Someone Hadley knew had seen her shelving canned goods in the fluorescent half-light. She hadn't looked up. I didn't feel vindicated. Just tired. Thomas texted me that morning, asking if I was okay. I told him I was... mostly. He replied with a simple "proud of you." That was enough. Late that afternoon, there was a knock on Hadley's door. I knew who it was before she opened it. Mom stood in the doorway, clutching her purse like it might run away. She looked smaller somehow. Not older, just collapsed inward. "Can we talk?" she asked. Hadley glanced at me, and I gave her a slight nod. Mom sat stiff on the edge of the guest room couch. I didn't move from the armchair. She started with small things. The fridge, the heating, the plants dying without the humidifier I used to refill. Then her voice cracked. "Calandra, sweetheart, we're trying, but it's too much." I let her speak. I waited. Finally, I said, "You told me you wanted to live without me." She flinched. "I didn't mean, but you said it. And you said it in front of people who still haven't reached out to ask if I'm okay." Tears welled in her eyes. "We need help." I nodded slowly. "Then it's time Mara and Dad figure out how to help you." I did my part, for 5 years. She didn't argue. She just sat for a moment longer, then stood, nodded tightly, and walked out. I watched the door close and felt something settle in me, not revenge. Just release. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about choosing myself. A week passed before I heard from them again. Not directly from my father, of course. He never called, never had, not even when I first moved out at 19. But he sent a message through Mom, scribbled in his square handwriting on the back of a gardening flyer she left in Hadley's mailbox. Think about what family means. I read it twice, 3 times, then folded it neatly and tucked it into the bottom of my tote bag without a word. Later that day, Mom called again. I let it go to voicemail. Her tone was softer this time, practiced, measured. We just wanted space. Calandra, not to lose you. That night, we were overwhelmed. Your father was tired. I didn't mean for it to come out that way, but it had come out that way, and not one person at that table had stopped it. Not even her. I called her back that evening. She answered on the second ring. You said you wanted to live without me, I said quietly. We were emotional. She insisted. We thought maybe it was time you found your own way. It wasn't about not appreciating you, but that's exactly what it was about. I said, you didn't want to feel dependent on me, so you decided to erase what I'd done instead. She was quiet for a long time. We miss you, she said finally. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. Then you should have said something different at the dinner table. I didn't wait for a response. I hung up and turned off my phone again. I had no interest in dragging myself back into a version of home where I was only valuable when invisible. Let them sit in the space they'd asked for. I wasn't going to rescue anyone from a silence they created. 3 months passed in quiet, steady separation. I didn't call, I didn't ask for updates, but news, like weeds, finds a way to grow. Diane from across the street sent me a photo one morning, no caption. Just an image of the old house with a crooked for sale sign stuck in the patchy front lawn. The grass had yellowed, the shutters were peeling, and the flower beds I once tended had been swallowed by weeds. I stared at the picture for a long time, not with satisfaction, not even sadness, just distance, like looking at a past life you no longer recognize as your own. They sold it 2 weeks later. Hadley told me the details in a whisper, as if speaking louder might make it feel real. The buyers were a couple from out of state. The price was low, far lower than it should have been, but the mortgage had fallen too far behind to wait for a better offer. Mom, Dad, and Mara moved into a rental on the far edge of the city, a 1-bedroom apartment above a consignment store. No backyard, no garage, no garden. I didn't visit, not out of spite. I just had no business going back. The house I grew up in had stopped being mine long before I walked out the side door that night. I was just the one who paid to keep it standing. Now, someone else would be walking through those rooms, repainting the walls, tearing out the old carpet. I hoped they wouldn't find the ledger of sacrifice buried beneath the foundation, because that story, my story, had finally ended. And I wasn't going to write another chapter in a house that had never truly made room for the woman I became. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and unmarked except for my name in neat handwriting I hadn't seen in a while. Mara. I let it sit on the counter for hours. I made tea, rearranged the books on the shelf, wiped down a table that wasn't dusty. Still. It waited. Still. I opened it. It was 2 pages, carefully written, carefully vague. She said she was sorry, said things had gotten out of hand, that she'd been stressed, overwhelmed. She mentioned the house sale, the move, how difficult it had all been. There was a line about missing the way things used to be, and a hope that maybe, one day, we could talk. But nowhere in those pages was the word grateful. Nowhere was the sentence, "You didn't deserve that." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with other things I no longer needed but couldn't quite throw away. I didn't write back. By then. I was in my own space, a modest condo in Eastwood with a narrow balcony and just enough room for peace. I worked part-time for a floral studio downtown, helping design wedding arrangements, teaching bouquet workshops to brides and kids and people who just liked color. I was building something again, not a business, not a legacy, just a quiet life that didn't require anyone else's permission to feel like mine. The phone rang sometimes, unknown numbers, voicemails that started with long pauses. I didn't pick up. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't opening a door that had only ever swung one way. And when I turned off the lamp each night, I did so without worrying who was still waiting in the dark. The walls of my condo are slowly filling with color flower sketches I've drawn on slow afternoons. Some framed, some taped with no particular plan. Peonies, lilies, daisies in motion, not for sale, not for display. Just for me. Each morning, I step onto the small balcony with my watering can. The planters are full now. Mint, rosemary, wildflowers, a stubborn ivy I nearly gave up on. The scent rises with the heat, soft and green. Sometimes I catch myself humming. My bank account isn't full, but it's mine. Every paycheck comes from work I choose, and every bill is one I signed up for. No one's name rides beside mine anymore. I no longer wake up checking for overdue notices. I no longer brace for the weight of someone else's silence. One evening, as the sky turned lavender, I stood barefoot on the balcony, Jose draped over my arm, mist catching the last bit of light, and I whispered it aloud, just once, just for me. I was never the burden. I was the builder. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. Inside, my phone rested on the table. No buzzing, no pleading, just stillness. And I let it stay that way, turning back to the vines curling toward the railing, roots clinging tight, growing where they were finally allowed to stay.